On August 14, 1994, the small industrial town of Dunford, Pennsylvania, woke to a sweltering Sunday morning that smelled faintly of diesel and river mud. By 10:42 a.m., veteran USPS carrier Michael Mick Hanley, age 43, was halfway through his route. His satchel was still full, his pace steady, when he turned onto Fenton Street, a quiet dead end with 4 weather-beaten houses, 1 abandoned factory, and a chain-link fence overgrown with honeysuckle. 40 minutes later, a local teenager found Mick's postal truck idling, driver's door open, keys still dangling from the ignition. Mail was strewn across the asphalt like fallen leaves. There was no sign of Mick. The police were called, but the responding patrol officer, later revealed trucking union, treated it like a case of heat stroke or a medical emergency. He roped off nothing, picked up several scattered envelopes himself, and tossed them back into the truck before paramedics even arrived. Mick's handheld USPS scanner, capable of logging GPS coordinates for every delivery, was missing entirely. Neighbors had heard nothing except the faint greel of a diesel engine around 10:50. The only other clue was a single set of deep tire marks leading away from the dead end toward a side alley where they abruptly disappeared. By noon, Dunford's main post office was in chaos. Supervisors called every possible hospital and station along Mick's route, but no one had seen him. Rumors started immediately. Mick was known for being punctual and reserved, but in the previous weeks, he'd been spotted arguing in hushed tones with a man outside the loading dock. That man, later identified as Big Frank Carvello, was the nephew of an alleged mob enforcer tied to the Kelowna crime family. Still, the lead was brushed off in the initial report. The environment around Fenton Street was a forgotten industrial pocket. The old Harrigan paper mill loomed over the street-boarded windows like sightless eyes. Grass grew waist-high in cracks along the loading ramp, and the air shimmered from heat radiating off. The surveillance cameras from the nearest corner store pointed toward the main avenue, not the dead end. The only functioning security lens was mounted on a warehouse the river, too far to catch more than early speculation pinned the disappearance on vagrants sheltering in the mill, but no signs of habitation. In the days that followed, the search perfunctory. Deputies combed nearby fields, dragged a section of the Dunford River, and checked abandoned cars. The case failed to gain media traction. After all, it was just a missing mailman, celebrity, or a child. By the end of the week, the official line was, "No foul play suspected," a statement that infuriated Mick's wife Lena, who knew her husband would never abandon his post voluntarily. What Lena didn't know, what no one outside a select circle realized, was that Mick's route intersected with an illicit courier pathway used by the Kelowna family to move cash, narcotics, and sensitive documents through inconspicuous channels. A USPS truck offered the perfect disguise, and Mick had recently become aware of unusual packages slipped into his satchel by someone other than postal. The moment he voiced his suspicions to the wrong ears, his fate was. The first chapter of the mystery closed not with answers, but with the quiet hum of a seized truck being towed away from Fenton Street, mail half sorted, and a man's life erased in broad daylight. Only years later would investigators learn just how many pieces of authority were paid to look the other way that morning. For the first 2 years, the investigation into Mick Hanley's disappearance drifted between active and dormant, like a bad signal. Lead detective Carl Brenner, a man who'd seen his share of cold cases, quickly realized his hands were tied, not by lack of evidence, but by invisible strings pulling from above. Requests for security footage from the riverfront freight yard were misfiled for months. A local judge denied a warrant for Carvello's property, citing insufficient probable cause, despite multiple tips placing his truck near Fenton Street that morning. The department's internal affairs unit quietly flagged 3 officers for suspicious overtime records, all of whom had been first responders that day. False leads multiplied. In 1996, a tip claimed Mick had been spotted alive in Ohio, working under a false name. Detectives drove 6 hours, only to find a man with a similar build and a completely different life. The GPS unit from Mick's route finally surfaced in 1997. Found in a pawn shop in Altoona, but its memory had been professionally wiped. Postal Service logs from that day were missing 10 consecutive entries, a gap that perfectly matched the time Mick vanished. When questioned, the Dunford postmaster said the records had been lost in a server migration, an excuse that would later be dismantled in court. The real blow came in 1998, when Lena received a letter postmarked from New York containing Mick's wedding ring and a typed note reading, "He delivered the wrong package." Forensics found no fingerprints, no DNA, no unique typewriter marks. The envelope had been handled with surgical precision. Brenner suspected it was a message from the Kalana family, a reminder to stay away. But Lena, stubborn as the river ice, refused to let the case fade. She began calling journalists, cold case units, and anyone who would listen. A break seemed to arrive in 2000 when a warehouse employee claimed he'd seen two men loading something heavy into a refrigerated truck the morning Mick vanished. He described one man as tall, with a limp, fitting Big Frank's profile, but the witness retracted his statement within a week, telling reporters he'd misremembered. Years later, it came out that his brother had suddenly received a no-show union job paying triple his previous wage. By then, the case file had swollen into 6 binders of dead ends. Brenner tried to push for a joint task force with federal agencies in 2003, but his request was rejected without explanation. Privately, an FBI contact told him certain organized crime cases were being managed to protect informants, an unspoken way of saying the Kalana family had friends in very high places. The idea that Mick's death could be swept under the rug for bureaucratic convenience left Brenner bitter and sleepless. The town of Dunford moved on. The old Harrigan paper mill was demolished in 2005, erasing what many believed was the crime scene. A strip mall went up where the weed-cracked lot had been, and Sunday shoppers parked where Mick's postal truck once sat idling in the August heat. To newcomers, Fenton Street was just another dead end. To Lena, it was a scar. By 2008, 14 years after the disappearance, the file sat in the inactive drawer. It might have stayed there forever if not for an unrelated DEA picked up the voice of Anthony Tony Glass Calderon, a mid-level Kalana associate, reminiscing about the mailman who got curious. The tap reignited interest at the federal level, setting in motion a chain of events that would finally crack, but only after more years of careful maneuvering and more lives put at risk. By 2009, the DEA's wiretap on Tony Glass had expanded into a multi-agency listening post, pulling in fragments of conversations from payphones, burner cells, and even encrypted messaging apps that the Kalana family thought were untouchable. Analysts caught references to packages on the blue truck, the river job, and Frank's mistake. Every scrap hinted that Mick Hanley's disappearance had not been a random act, but a sanctioned operation. The problem was turning vague chatter into admissible evidence without tipping off half the town's power structure, which was riddled with Kalana sympathizers. The task force, composed of select DEA, FBI, and postal inspectors, set up in an unmarked office above a laundromat in Pittsburgh. Files from the original investigation were quietly requisitioned, scanned, and analyzed with modern software, revealing patterns the 1990s investigators had missed. The tampered USPS logs matched the exact travel times of known Kalana cash. Moreover, newly digitized aerial photographs from that day showed a white refrigerated truck parked behind the Harrigan mill at 10:51 a.m., partially obscured by the It was the first solid visual link to the witness testimony that had been buried years earlier. Still, the Kalana family had layers of insulation. Informants inside the police and county offices tipped them off about standard subpoenas and search warrants, so the task force resorted to black bag operations, covert entries into properties under legal gray zones, planting hidden mics in warehouses, and GPS trackers on vehicles without official paperwork. It was dangerous territory. One mistake could sink the entire case and end careers. But after 15 years of stonewalling, Brenner, now brought in as a consultant, was willing to push the edge. In late 2010, a breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. Surveillance caught Tony Glass meeting with a truck driver named Reggie Lomax, known to haul Kalana goods through Pennsylvania and Ohio. The audio was garbled by wind, but one phrase was clear. It was Frank's job, but Tony made it messy. Cross-referencing truck schedules showed Lomax had been in Dunford on August 14, 1994, delivering perishables to a company that no longer existed. Investigators believed perishables was code for a human cargo that wasn't supposed to survive the trip. The problem was Big Frank himself. He'd gone to ground years earlier, last spotted in Florida under an alias. Without him, they couldn't confirm who gave the order to remove Mick. But in early 2011, a lucky break came from Florida Highway Patrol, who pulled over a speeding SUV in Palm Beach County and found an unregistered pistol and a man using the name Joseph D'Angelo. Fingerprints revealed it was Frank Carvello. His arrest for firearms possession put him on the radar, but Florida prosecutors seemed oddly hesitant to pursue. Pressure from unseen quarters was still at work. Undeterred, the task force decided to stage an off-the-books surveillance on Carvello, hoping he'd lead them to Tony Glass or other high-value targets. Over months, they documented meetings in dimly lit bars, cash drops in bowling alley parking lots, and one tense sit-down at a dockside seafood shack where Frank argued loudly about the mail job coming back to bite us. The words were enough to trigger a quiet green light, find a way to bring him in federally, where local corruption couldn't bury the case again. In the spring of 2012, they got their chance. A planned drug shipment from the Kalana's Midwest operation was intercepted in a sting, and Frank was caught delivering an envelope of marked bills to a contact he didn't realize was wired. This time, the evidence was airtight. The U.S. Marshals moved in fast, extracting him from a motel at dawn under the pretense of a parole check. By sunset, Frank Carvello was in federal custody, staring at a table covered with photos, bank records, and GPS plots of his movements, each one a nail in his coffin unless he started talking. Frank Carvello sat in interview room B, his hands cuffed loosely to a bolted steel ring on the table. The air smelled of burnt coffee carpet, the hum of the overhead light, a constant irritant. Across from him, Special Agent Dana Leclerc of the FBI laid out a neat array of evidence, surveillance photos, phone logs, and a grainy still of the refrigerated truck from 1990. She didn't speak for the first 5 minutes, letting the silence stretch. Frank smirked at first, leaning back in his chair, but his eyes darted toward the pile of documents, like a man scanning for escape routes. Leclerc began with the easy hits: drug shipments, union skims, intimidation, each backed with audio or paper trail. Frank deflected, feigned ignorance, or laughed outright. But when she slid across a photo of Lena Hanley, taken at her kitchen table with a framed picture of Mick in the background, his grin faltered. She told him about the ring in the envelope, the wiped GPS, the witness who misremembered after a sudden career change. Then she dropped the part he didn't expect. The DEA had Lomax in custody, and Lomax was already... It wasn't true. Lomax was still under observation, but Frank didn't know that. He shifted in his seat, rubbing his wrists against the metal. Leclerc leaned in, voice stacked federal charges, decades in prison, and Kalana's enforcers convinced he'd flipped anyway. You'll do your time looking over your shoulder in the yard, and you won't see it coming when they pay someone to make it quick. The bravado in his posture drained just a fraction. Brenner entered then, older now, but still with the bulldog stare Frank remembered from Dunford. He dropped a folder containing a single page, a 1994 delivery manifest with an unlisted package routed through Mick Hanley's satchel, originating from a Kalana-controlled warehouse. Frank stared at it like a ghost. Brenner told him they knew the package wasn't just drugs, it was leverage material, evidence that could ruin a state senator. Mick had seen inside by accident, and from that moment, the Kalanas couldn't let him finish his route. The tension stretched for an hour. Frank asked for a lawyer, then changed his mind. He tried bargaining for witness protection, then scoffed at the idea of ratting. But when Leclerc laid out a photo of his teenage grandson, along with the thinly veiled reminder of how family treated loose ends, something cracked. The big shoulders slumped. His gaze went to the tabletop, and his voice, when it came, was a rasp. It was the river job. We had to make it look clean. Once he started, the confession poured out in jagged bursts. On August 14, 1994, Mick had been blocked in on Fenton Street by Lomax's refrigerated truck. Two men, Frank and a driver named Gino Martelli, pulled him into the back, bound him with tape, and kept him gagged. They drove to the paper mill lot where Tony Glass was waiting with the package Mick had handled. The package was swapped into a different courier vehicle, and Mick was shoved back into the refrigerator. They left him there, alive but barely conscious, until they reached a dock on the Dunford River. Frank admitted they weighted Mick down with and dropped him into the water just past the old grain terminal. Cold water, heavy chain, gone in minutes. The GPS unit was destroyed, the logs wiped Kalana payroll, and the tire tracks in the alley were erased with a load of fresh gravel. The Harrigan Mill rumors were deliberate, bait for investigators in the wrong. Everything had been choreographed to look like Mick walked away or met some random street fate. By the time Frank stopped talking, the room felt colder. Leclerc signaled for the recording to be backed up twice. Brenner didn't thank him. There was nothing in this truth that deserved gratitude, but he knew this was the crack they'd been waiting. The next step was to turn it into action before the Kalanas realized one of their own had opened the door. The morning after Frank's confession, the task force met in the laundromat's upstairs office under blackout. Phones were left in Faraday pouches, windows covered with paper. Leclerc sketched the Dunford River's grain terminal on a whiteboard, marking the coordinates Frank had given. Brenner knew they couldn't delay. Once word leaked, the Kalanas would sweep the site, and whatever was left of Mick Hanley would vanish for good. A dive team from Pittsburgh was dispatched before dawn, their boat hidden under the cover of a maintenance barge. At the same time, sealed warrants were signed for the arrest of Tony Glass and Gino Martelli, along with 3 postal supervisors tied to Kalana laundering operation. The marshals planned simultaneous hits in Pittsburgh, Dunford, and Youngstown to minimize the chance of a tip-off. Even so, the fear of leaks gnawed at everyone. They'd seen too many operations crumble because someone in a badger suit made a quiet call to the wrong friend. The dive team worked in choppy brown water that stank of rust and algae. Visibility was barely a foot, forcing them to comb by feel. After an hour, one diver surfaced, holding a corroded length of chain with a clasp still locked. A second diver emerged with a fragment of denim, the brass rivet stamped with Levi Strauss. Then, just before noon, they found the remains, partial, skeletal, the jaw still bearing 2 dental crowns that matched Mick's records exactly. The chain had fused to the bones in places, proof of Frank's story. Back on shore, evidence techs handled the remains with almost ceremonial care. Brenner watched from the dock, hand shoved deep in his coat pocket, the smell of river water clinging to his nostril. He knew Lena would want to be told immediately, but protocol demanded the coroner confirm identity first. Still, in his gut, there was no doubt. After 18 years, Mick had finally come home, though not in the way anyone wanted. Meanwhile, the raids unfolded like clockwork. Martelli was caught in his kitchen, still in his bathrobe, with a loaded revolver on the table. The postal supervisors were taken from their offices in plain view of startled co-workers. But in Youngstown, the team hit Tony Glass's apartment and found it empty, the back door ajar. A neighbor reported seeing a black SUV peel out minutes before the agents arrived. It was the first sign that the Kalanas might already be. That afternoon, Frank was moved into a federal safe house, 24-hour guard. He'd signed a formal cooperation agreement in exchange for relocation and protection for his grandson. But Brenner knew the Kalanas wouldn't forgive or forget. If Glass gets away, you're a dead man, he told Frank bluntly. Frank didn't argue. He just lit another cigarette and stared out the window. By nightfall, the press was sniffing around. Someone had leaked that human remains were recovered from the Dunford River in connection with a decades-old disappearance. Reporters camped outside Lena Hanley's house, camera lights flickering against the curtain. The task force had planned to keep the find secret for at least 48 hours, but now the clock was ticking faster. Somewhere out there, Tony Glass was running, and he had every reason to burn whatever was left, the Kalana family's secret. By the morning of the second day, every law enforcement contact east of the Mississippi had Tony Glass's face and aliases in their inbox. The man was a chameleon, known to bleach his hair, swap glasses for contacts, and rotate through 3 or 4 different wardrobes, depending on the crowd. Credit card databases showed no activity. His bank accounts were clean. But a wiretap on a low-level Kalana bookie picked up a coded message. The piano needs tuning in, Cleveland. Agents interpreted it as a prearranged safe-house location. A joint FBI Marshals surveillance team was deployed to Cleveland's Old Warehouse District, working from unmarked vans and cold coffee. For 2 nights, they watched a nondescript brick building with a pawn shop on the ground floor and a boarded stairwell at the side. On the 3rd night, a dark SUV arrived, headlights off. A man matching Glass's profile slipped out and disappeared inside. Minutes later, the rear alley door opened, and 2 more men carried in a duffel bag heavy enough to strain their arms. The team didn't move. They needed confirmation it was Glass before making. That confirmation came at 2:17 a.m. when the man stepped outside to smoke, lit by the alley's one functioning street lamp. A high-resolution lens caught his jawline and the scar across his chin. Glass. The command channel lit up with instruction, but there was hesitation. Busting him on the street risked losing whatever was in the duffel, which could be evidence of Kalana operation. They decided to wait until morning, hoping to hit him inside when the building was quiet. It nearly backfired. At 5:42 a.m., Glass left through the front, carrying a different duffel and heading straight for the SUV. The team moved fast. 2 cars blocked the street, agents in tactical vests pouring out. Glass bolted down the block, weaving between dumpsters and scattering pigeons. He made it 2 alleys over before being tackled by Marshal Jorge Espinoza, who'd played college linebacker and hadn't lost. The second duffel was retrieved from the SUV. Inside, $280,000 in shrink-wrapped bills and a ledger written in codes the FBI had. Glass's capture was a shot of adrenaline for the task force, but the danger was far from over. During transport, he remained silent, eyes flicking to every passing car like he expected one to open. The moment he was booked into federal holding, rumors began swirling through the Kalana network that the walls were closing in. Surveillance chatter suggested certain members were already arranging for evidence to be destroyed, properties to be emptied, and witnesses to go quiet. Brenner and Leclerc decided they couldn't wait. Within 12 hours, warrants were filed for coordinated raids on 3 Kalana stash houses and 2 front businesses. The goal wasn't just arrests. It was to seize whatever physical records or contraband could tie the leadership to Mick Hanley's death and other racketeering operations. In cases like this, paper and ledgers were worth more than bullets. But behind the surge of operational energy, Brenner carried a gnawing dread. The Kalanas had weathered investigations before, often emerging bloodied but intact, their leaders untouched. This time, they had Mick's remains, Frank's confession, and now Glass in custody. But the question remained, would it be enough to pierce the family's armor, or would another generation inherit the same untouchable? Tony Glass sat at the end of the interrogation, wrists chained, posture loose, but eyes. He didn't flinch when Leclerc entered with the duffel bag's SUV, nor when Brenner dropped the coded ledger onto the table with a heavy slap. "You know what this is, Brenner. It's the Kalana family's entire financial spine." Glass smirked, leaning back as though unimpressed. But the way his gaze lingered on the book told a different story. He knew that if the FBI cracked those codes, half the family could be. The first hour was a dance. Glass dodged questions, offered false names, and claimed the ledger was just numbers for a Leclerc shifted tactics, playing a segment of Frank Carvello's recorded confession through a tinny speaker. At the moment Frank described Tony waiting at the Harrigan Mill with the package Mick had handled, Glass's smirk thinned into a hard line. He said nothing, but his jaw twitched, a tell Brenner had learned to spot years ago. They pressed harder, bringing up the $280,000 and the matching handwriting sample from other seized ledgers. When Glass still refused to budge, Leclerc deployed a move she'd used only once before. She laid out autopsy photos of Mick's recovered remains, chains still looped through bone, water-worn denim clinging in shreds. She described how Lena had waited 18 years for her husband to come home, only to receive him in a body bag. "That's your work, your river job." For the first time, Glass's gaze dropped to the table. He didn't touch the photos, but he didn't look away. Then Brenner leaned in. The ledger wasn't just in FBI. Copies had been made, sealed, and were ready to be leaked to the press if anything happened to Frank Carvello or to Tony himself. "The family can't save you by killing you. They can only watch you go down." Glass's breathing changed, slower, heavier. Finally, he asked for a cigarette. Once lit, he exhaled. His account filled the gaps. Mick had opened the package at the mill after spotting It wasn't on his manifest. Inside were photographs and bank statements tying a Pennsylvania state senator to illegal shipments of prescription opioids and cash kickbacks. The Calanas had been paid to move the evidence out of state before a federal audit. Mick's mistake was confronting Glass about it on the spot, thinking it was some kind of postal mix. We couldn't just let him finish the route. He knew too much, and Glass detailed the cover-up with chilling precision. The postal supervisors erased digital records, replacing them with dummy entries for non-existent deliveries. Tire tracks were masked, the refrigerated truck's plates swapped with those from a scrapped vehicle. Witnesses were bribed or threatened. The Harrigan Mill rumors were planted intentionally. 2 Kalana associates found staged evidence there and tipped police. Every move was designed to stretch the investigation thin, bleed resources, and convince the town Mick had simply vanished into the wind. By the time Glass stopped, the ledger on the table felt heavier. His statement corroborated Frank's in every significant detail, but it also exposed names the task force hadn't expected: 2 county commissioners, a police lieutenant, and the very judge who'd once denied Brenner's warrant in 1994. The confession transformed the case from a cold disappearance into a full-blown corruption scandal. And yet, Brenner knew, getting convictions on that scale meant moving faster than the Calanas could close ranks. Outside the interview room, Leclerc called in the code word to greenlight the next phase: mass arrest. Somewhere across town, Lena Hanley sat by her phone, unaware that the 2 men who'd ended her husband's life had just told the world exactly how they'd done it. The operation was set for 4:00 a.m., when the streets were quiet and the Calanas least alert. Federal, state, and select local units rolled out in synchronized waves, targeting 17 addresses in 3 counties. Brenner rode with the team heading for the Dunford Courthouse Annex, where one of the implicated county commissioners lived in a luxury apartment paid for entirely in cash. At the same moment, another team breached the home of a police lieutenant who had signed off on false reports in 1994. The element of surprise was absolute. No time for calls, no time for shredders. In Pittsburgh, a SWAT team descended on a gated property belonging to the state senator named in Glass's confession. Agents seized 2 safes, one filled with stacks of unmarked bills, the other with a pistol registered to an alias and a folder of incriminating correspondence. The senator was taken away in handcuffs, his robe flapping in the pre-dawn wind, the flash of cameras from a tipped-off journalist marking the moment. The Kalana hierarchy had never been hit this high up the food chain in Pennsylvania before. Meanwhile, in Youngstown, marshals hit a pair of warehouses used for laundering cash through a faux import business. Ledgers matching the one from Glass's duffel were found in a locked office, along with a ledger key that began translating the code. It was the golden ticket, tying money directly from Kalana operations to political campaigns, property purchases, and offshore accounts. Brenner knew it was enough to dismantle the family's local power structure if the prosecution stuck, but the fallout was immediate and violent. By sunrise, pro-Kalana loyalists inside law enforcement were scrambling to delay bookings, misfile evidence, or leak information to outside contacts. A suspicious fire broke out at a records warehouse linked to one of the arrested commissioners, destroying thousands of paper files before firefighters contained it. There were whispers of retaliatory hits being planned on witnesses. The task force had to move Frank and Glass to separate undisclosed facilities under heavier guard. Lena Hanley learned of the arrests when a reporter called her at dawn for comment. She turned on the TV to see Brenner standing stone-faced outside the courthouse, refusing to answer questions. The reality sank in slowly. The men who had taken Mick were finally facing justice, and the network that had protected them was collapsing. Still, when asked how she felt, she could only say, "It's not joy. It's not closure. It's just less empty." In Dunford, reactions split down the middle. Some residents celebrated the arrests as long-overdue payback for decades of intimidation. Others feared the vacuum left by the Kalanas would be filled by something worse, a younger, hungrier crew with fewer scruples. Business owners whispered about who might be next, while old debts were quietly settled before new enforcers could come collecting. The town's undercurrent of unease didn't vanish, it simply shifted. By evening, Brenner sat in the laundromat office staring at the arrest board, names crossed out in red. He knew the case wasn't truly over. Trials could drag for years, evidence could be suppressed, witnesses could vanish, but for the first time since 1994, the truth had a fighting chance in daylight. And somewhere in a locked evidence freezer, Mick Hanley's chain lay coiled, a silent witness that the river hadn't kept its secret forever. The first hearings began in late spring, with the courthouse surrounded by metal barricades and federal marshals posted on every corner. Defendants shuffled in wearing suits instead of orange jumpsuits, a calculated effort by their lawyers to soften the image for jurors. Lena Hanley sat in the front row for each session, clutching Mick's old USPS cap. She listened without flinching as defense attorneys painted her husband as a meddler who put himself in harm's way, an insult that sent a ripple of anger through the gallery. Frank Carvello took the stand under heavy guard, his voice low but steady, as he recounted the events of August 14, 1994. Glass followed, his testimony confirming the senator's role in ordering the destruction of the incriminating package and authorizing Mick's removal. The prosecution projected maps, photographs, and chain of custody logs on courtroom screens, drawing a straight, undeniable line from the Kelowna hierarchy to the dead-end street where Mick's route ended forever. Jurors watched closely. Some scribbled notes furiously. The defense strategy leaned heavily on discrediting witnesses. They brought up Frank's criminal history, suggesting he was lying for a reduced sentence. They hinted that Glass had fabricated elements to protect himself from retaliation in prison, but when postal supervisors, once thought untouchable, confirmed under oath that they'd falsified delivery logs and were paid in cash, the defense's credibility began to erode. It was the first time the Kelowna's paper shield had cracked in open court. For Brenner, the trial was a grind. Every day meant reliving the case he'd carried for nearly 2 decades. He sat behind the prosecution, jotting notes, feeding questions, and watching for shifts in juror expression. There were moments of quiet triumph, like when the ledger codes were decoded in front of the jury, each entry linking cash to a named official, but also gut punches, such as when the coroner described the condition of Mick's remains in clinical detail. Even after years in homicide, it made Brenner's stomach. The media turned the trial into a spectacle. Outside the courthouse, news vans formed a permanent wall, their generators humming day and night. National outlets dubbed it the mailman case, while local papers ran sidebars on the Kelowna's history of evading justice. Lena avoided interviews, but her quiet presence in court became a symbol, a reminder that this wasn't just about mob money and political corruption, but about a man who had kissed his wife goodbye one August morning and never returned. When the verdicts came, they landed like hammer blows. The state senator, guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy, obstruction, and racketeering. Glass and Carvello, guilty on federal murder charges, sentenced to life without parole. The corrupt postal supervisors, guilty of conspiracy and falsifying federal records. The police lieutenant, guilty of obstruction and aiding organized crime. The commissioner, guilty of money laundering and conspiracy. Cheers erupted outside, though inside, the judge maintained strict decorum. Lena wept quietly, not from joy, but from the release of a weight she'd carried for 18 years. Brenner sat beside her afterward, saying nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. The trials had delivered justice on paper, but the river had already cleared its debt. No verdict could rewrite that day in 1994 or give Mick back the years stolen from him. As the courthouse emptied, the echoes of the gavel still hung in the air, a sound that was both an ending and a reminder of what couldn't be undone. Months after the verdict, Dunford wore its unease like an old coat, familiar, frayed, never quite comfortable. The Kelowna properties sat behind chain link and foreclosure notice, their driveways overgrown with weeds. Some locals claimed the family's was broken. Others whispered about younger enforcers already taking over the gambling den backroom loan book. For Lena Hanley, none of it. She visited Mick's grave each Sunday, leaving a folded envelope on the headstone. Letters she never mailed, filled with the small details of days he never saw. Brenner retired from consulting soon after, citing exhaustion more than age. The case had been his longest and most personal, and though it ended in convictions, it had also shown him how deep rot could go in the institutions he once trusted implicitly. Sometimes, in the quiet of his apartment, he'd hear the phantom hum of Mick's postal truck and picture that dead-end street under a harsh August sun. He knew he would never truly be free of it. Frank Carvello lived out his days in a federal facility under a different name, though protection in prison was a relative term. Glass was housed separately, his ledger testimony having made him too valuable and too hated to mix with the general population. Both men appealed their sentences, both were denied, and both learned to live with the knowledge that the Colanas considered them ghosts already, dead men walking behind concrete walls. The state senator's fall sent ripples through the legislature, with committees and subcommittees launched to investigate ethics breaches. Brenner didn't bother to follow them. He'd seen enough commissions stall and fade. He knew real reform was slow, and that for every official caught, two more learned to hide better. Justice in Dunford had been a fight won in inches, not in miles, and the battlefield remained littered with what-ifs. The riverbank where Mick's remains had been found was eventually fenced off, posted with weathered signs warning of unstable soil, but every so often someone would leave flowers tied to the chain link, plastic petals fluttering in the wind. No one ever claimed them, and no one removed them. Lena suspected they were from old postal colleagues, the ones who'd quietly helped Brenner in the early years when official channels turned to stone. Life in Dunford carried on. The strip mall where the Harrigan paper mill once stood was busy on weekends. Kids rode bikes past Fenton Street without knowing the story. Yet in certain corners, the old bar on Main, the diner by the river, people still spoke of the mailman who delivered the wrong package, and the phrase had and urban legends, truth known only to the lived. And so the story closed as it had begun, on a dead-end street under a summer sun, the hum of a truck's engine echoing faintly in the memory of those who'd chased it for 18 long years. Justice had come, but the river still kept part of Mick Hanley, as if reminding everyone that some debts are never fully paid and some absences never filled. In Dunford, emptiness lingered, a quiet shadow cast across every August day. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping true crime and mystery, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us bring more suspense, intrigue, and shocking revelations straight to you.